Welcome to a new session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books. In this session, we'll begin an exploration of the three most important works of the Victorian novelist Charles Dickens. Those works are David Copperfield, written in 1850, A Tale of Two Cities, written in 1859, and Great Expectations, written in 1860. We'll consider these books in the order in which they were written, beginning with David Copperfield. Charles Dickens is regarded as one of the greatest English writers, and his name and stories are known to almost everyone in the Western world. Dickens' books, which have often been made into movies and plays, are distinctive for two important reasons. One, because they vividly describe the social conditions of the time, and two, because of their deep pathos and melodrama. Some of his books are also notable for their humor, and for Dickens' ability to create comic and eccentric characters with quirky names and humorous habits. Dickens' books have endured for over a century. They still sell well and are widely taught in literature classes, and are often performed in modern dramatizations. He's also been an inspiration to many accomplished writers who followed him, among them Dostoevsky and Kafka. Margaret Mitchell even paid homage to Dickens in her classic novel Gone with the Wind. There's a scene where a group of Southern women read David Copperfield out loud to each other to distract themselves from the fact that their men have gone out to raid a shantytown to avenge an attempted rape of Scarlett O'Hara. Mitchell was recognizing the immense popularity of Dickens during his time, in this case the Civil War years, and the enduring ability his books have to hold and enthrall the reader. Dickens' novels are powerful because they accurately record the bleak conditions of Victorian England, and yet he always manages to bring hope and optimism to them. The settings of his various books have included ugly prisons and factories, orphanages, workhouses, the streets of the slums, and even a bloody and violent revolution. He uncovers for us the cruelty and harshness of his era, but he always does so with wit, satire, and a sense of compassion for the underdog. Dickens created villains who were greedy, deceitful, and even sadistic, but he also created heroes and heroines who were honest and good, and who eventually rose above the moral decay that surrounded them. Often these heroes were children. One of Dickens' special talents was his ability to see life through the point of view of a child, and he did so with unmatched sensitivity and insight. David Copperfield is one of those books, for in the first half of the story, the hero is only a boy, and all we see and experience is filtered through his own innocent eyes. The entire book is written in the first person as David, now a man, reflects on his life and the circumstances which formed his character. David Copperfield is the most autobiographical of any of Dickens' works. Many of the events in the story parallel events in Dickens' life, and some of the characters are drawn from characters he knew. In fact, by the end of the story, Copperfield has become a successful writer. The story begins right before David Copperfield is orphaned, and follows him through school, a variety of jobs, and 2 marriages, until he finally attains success and contentment. On the way, he experiences many hardships, including the brutality of a cruel stepfather, a vicious headmaster, and the degradation of working as a child laborer. His great aunt comes to his rescue and sends him to a decent school. Later, he apprentices to a lawyer, whose daughter becomes a friend, and later his second wife. But his first marriage is unsuitable. His wife is flighty and childish, and David longs for someone who can understand and uplift him. When she dies and he remarries, his life at last seems to be going in the right direction. At the end of the book, he is happily pursuing a career as a writer and looks back on the tumultuous events that brought him to the present. In the process of describing Copperfield's life, Dickens also manages to become a social commentator and an energetic advocate of children's rights. The book includes descriptions of the worst abuses and inequities of his time: the terrible schools, child labor, debtors' prisons, unsanitary slums, and the general lack of respect and compassion for children, especially poor children. But these indictments aside, Dickens is foremost an entertainer, and the story from beginning to end is compelling and emotional. David Copperfield, like many of Dickens' works, was originally serialized. It was written in 20 parts, or episodes, and one was published each month. Those reading the novel can clearly see this. Each chapter has its own climax, and characters are often reintroduced to remind readers of who they are. When it was released, it wasn't as popular as Dickens' preceding works, probably because it was too realistic, and readers then preferred simple melodrama. Although the term realism wasn't applied to fiction until a few years later, David Copperfield, perhaps because it's partly autobiographical, is considered the most realistic of all Dickens' work. Now times have changed. In the 20th century, readers appreciate realism. David Copperfield proved to be Dickens' most popular book, and there are more copies of it, both hardbound and paperback, than any of his other works. It was also the favorite work of the author himself. Charles Dickens wrote, "Of all the books, I like this the best. Like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield." The proud parent of David Copperfield was born in England on February 7, 1812, the second of 8 children. Charles Dickens' father, a Navy clerk, was careless with money, and he was imprisoned for debt when young Charles was only 12. It was the most significant and terrible event of Dickens' life. Even up until his death, it was a subject he could barely talk about. Dickens was taken out of school and put to work in a shoe dye factory. He lived alone in the attic of a lodging house, ashamed and fearful his parents had deserted him. Dickens' father soon came into an inheritance, and he was put back into school. At 15, he went to work in a law firm, and later he became a reporter, first of law cases, then of parliamentary proceedings. He was a hard and dedicated worker, and an astute observer. He began writing comic sketches, later entitled Sketches by Boz. The pseudonym Boz was suggested by his brother's pronunciation of Moses when he had a cold. In 1836, Dickens wrote the Pickwick Papers, and was internationally famous within 4 months. At the same time, he became editor of a monthly magazine in which he began serializing Oliver Twist and later Nicholas Nickleby. He also married Catherine Hogarth, a marriage which produced 10 children but was nevertheless a deeply unhappy marriage. The two finally separated 20 years later. In 1840, Dickens started a weekly periodical in which he published, among other works, The Old Curiosity Shop, a popular story that sold over 100,000 copies when released in book form. He also began to write annual Christmas stories, the first of which was A Christmas Carol, a story that is a perennial favorite and is still dramatized at schools and public theaters around the world. Charles Dickens was a busy man. He was writing and editing journals, writing novels, and he was also involved in social work. He helped found a home for reformed prostitutes, and he lobbied for slum clearance, sanitation, and educational reform. Dickens was becoming more and more concerned with urban issues, and was establishing himself as perhaps the first great urban novelist. In 1850, he wrote David Copperfield, and in 1852, he released Bleak House, which described a corrupt judicial system. It isn't among his most popular works, but many critics consider it his masterpiece. In 1853, Dickens began to give public readings of his works, originally for charity. He loved theater and had once organized an amateur theatrical company of his own. His readings were immensely popular, and one American tour earned him $100,000 in only 6 months, an astronomical sum for the time. His reading tours were exhausting and eventually sapped his strength and hastened his end. In 1857, he wrote Little Dorrit, a story haunted by grim prison scenes, and in 1859 he wrote A Tale of Two Cities, about the French Revolution. That was followed by Great Expectations, another story of a boy's coming of age. In 1865 he finished his last novel, Our Mutual Friend. Dickens' work was enormous and fatiguing. He barely stayed ahead of deadlines, and he complained of insomnia and exhaustion. He died of a stroke on June 9, 1870, at the age of 58, and was buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. Dickens had a close relationship with his readers, perhaps closer than any other author. In fact, one scholar has said that he died of popularity. He always wrote with the goal of wide readership, and his fans range from the poor and barely literate to the aristocratic, although the bulk of his readers belong to the middle class. He aimed to please these people, but also to stir their conscience. He was able to write about social ills by using comedy and melodrama to make them more palatable. His humor and sentiment, side by side with horrifying ugliness, is what makes his novels so distinctive. Charles Dickens lived at a time when he could witness the transformation of England from a rural agricultural society to a commercial industrial society of factories, slums, and the rising middle class. It's this change which is so powerfully chronicled in his novels, and which makes them not just dramatic stories, but social histories. David Copperfield is one of the most intricate of Dickens' works. It's long, over 60 chapters, and contains scores of characters and subplots. Although it's sometimes considered a children's classic, in reality, it's a challenging book to read, and the plot requires much concentration. Let's now meet the central characters of David Copperfield. Although there are well over 30 characters who play significant roles, we'll start with just a dozen or so who are most important. David Copperfield. David is a sensitive boy who flourishes under affection and respect, but suffers terribly when confronted with cruelty. As the story progresses, he develops strength and becomes a hard, diligent worker. He's honest and compassionate. Clara Peggotty. A servant in the house of his mother, Peggotty loves David and becomes his surrogate mother after his own mother dies. Ham Peggotty. The nephew of Clara's brother, and an orphan like David. A very decent man, engaged to little Emily, who deserts him. Ham dies trying to save the life of the man who turns out to be Emily's seducer. Little Emily. Another Peggotty orphan. Pretty and intelligent, but determined to rise socially. She deserts Ham, who loves her, for David's disreputable friend James Steerforth. When Steerforth deserts her in disgrace and grief, she moves to Australia with her uncle. Betsy Trotwood. David's great-aunt, somewhat blustery but with a heart of gold. She rescues him from his misfortunes, just like a fairy godmother. Edward Murdstone. David's stepfather, cruel and domineering. He bullies David's mother and abuses David. Jane Murdstone. Edward's sister and just as cruel as he. Later she becomes the chaperone of Dora, the girl with whom David falls in love. Tommy Traddles. One of two of David's school friends who play a role in the book. The other is James Steerforth. Tommy is loyal and plodding and helps David expose the evil plans of the villainous Uriah Heep. James Steerforth. David's other friend. Egotistical and arrogant, he betrays his friendship with David by seducing Emily. It takes David quite a while to see Steerforth for what he is, although Agnes, who loves David, sees it right away. Wilkins Micawber. One of Dickens' most comedic characters. Happy, garrulous, and optimistic, Micawber gives David a home for a time and later becomes a clerk to the evil Uriah Heep. He helps David thwart Heep's nasty plans. Uriah Heep. Unctuous, oily, and hypocritical, he's a classic Dickens villain. He's the clerk in the law offices of Mr. Wickfield, who despises the upper class, yet is determined to climb his way up. He accomplishes this chiefly by trickery and deceit. He's trying to force Wickfield's daughter Agnes to marry him, but is exposed as a forger and later ends up in prison. Mr. Wickfield. He's the lawyer for David's great-aunt, Betsy Trotwood, and falls prey to Uriah Heep's schemes. A widower who sometimes drinks, Mr. Wickfield has a daughter, Agnes, who loves David and eventually becomes his second wife. Agnes Wickfield, Wickfield's devoted daughter, an efficient housekeeper, sweet and serene, who David respects as a sister at first and finally comes to love. Dora Spenlow. The daughter of one of David's employers, who becomes his first wife. Pampered and raised in luxury, she completely lacks practicality and intellect, and is a burden to David. Conveniently, she dies after only a few years of marriage. These are the key characters of David Copperfield. Now, to the story. The story is told by David Copperfield as a grown man, a successful novelist, husband of the lovely Agnes, and father of several young children. He's reflecting on his early life for a memoir he says is for his eyes only. The memoir begins with his birth. David Copperfield is born 6 months after his father's death. Waiting at his birth is his great-aunt Betsy Trotwood, a strong-willed woman who storms out when she discovers the baby isn't a girl. Aunt Betsy had hoped they'd name the girl after her, and that she could be her friend. David spends his early years with his quiet, gentle mother and their housekeeper, Peggotty. When his mother takes up with a Mr. Murdstone, both David and Peggotty are distressed. The man is slick and domineering, and David overhears a conversation that indicates Murdstone is after his mother's annuity. Peggotty tells her mistress that such a one as this Mr. Copperfield wouldn't have liked. Soon David is sent off on vacation with Peggotty. He's excited to go and reminisces, "How eager I was to leave my happy home. To think how little I suspected that I did leave forever." Peggotty takes him to visit her brother Daniel, a fisherman. He lives with his orphan nephew Ham and his orphan niece, little Emily, the children of 2 different brothers. He also has a housekeeper who is the widow of a former partner. The generous Daniel Peggotty takes care of them all. They're kind and simple people, and David loves them. He and Emily share a special friendship. She tells him of her dream to be a real lady when she grows up. On their way home from vacation, Peggotty tells David he has a new father, Mr. Murdstone. When David arrives, his mother doesn't greet him with her usual affection. Instead, her new husband tells her to control herself, and always control yourself. David finds his new stepfather has also moved in his sister, Jane Murdstone. Both are cruel to David, and David's mother hasn't the courage to interfere. When David bites Murdstone's hand during a savage beating, he's first locked in his room for 5 days, then sent off to a school near London. When the cart carrying him to school leaves home, Peggotty runs after it and slips David some cookies and 2 half-crowns. The driver of the cart, a man named Barkis, tells David to send Peggotty a note with the message, "Barkis is willin'." The school is run by a vicious headmaster named Mr. Creakle, who takes pleasure in beating his students. When David arrives, he's made to wear a sign that says, "Take care, he bites." He's lonely and humiliated. But David makes 2 friends there, the arrogant and wealthy James Steerforth and the dull but loyal Tommy Traddles. With their friendship, he's able to endure the hardships of school and the wrath of Mr. Creakle, of whom David says, "There never can have been a man who enjoyed his profession more than Mr. Creakle did. He had a delight at cutting at the boys, which was like the satisfaction of a craving appetite." Creakle never whips Steerforth. He's too awed by his social position. But his favorite victim is Traddles, who often takes the punishment for others, including Steerforth. One day, Mr. Peggotty and his nephew Ham come to visit David. They're impressed by Steerforth's charms and invite him to visit them someday. It's holiday and time for David to make a visit home. He's once again picked up in a cart by the driver Barkis, who says his first message to Peggotty that he's willin' wasn't answered. He asked David to send another. David arrives home and finds his mother has a new baby. They have a short time alone, and David is filled with warmth towards him. David gives Peggotty the message from Barkis, but she laughs and says she wouldn't marry him if he were made of gold. Soon the Murdstones return home, and David spends the rest of his miserable holiday avoiding them, hiding in the kitchen with the servants. On the day he's to leave, he kisses his mother and new brother goodbye and says, "I was not sorry to go, for the gulf between us was there." On his 10th birthday at school, David is happily awaiting the arrival of presents from home. But instead, Mr. Creakle gives him bad news. His mother is dead. David returns home for the funeral, where Peggotty tells him his mother gradually faded under the oppressive atmosphere in the house, and that the baby died soon after she did. David says, "The mother who lay in the grave was the mother of my infancy. The little creature in her arms was myself, as I had once been, hushed forever on her bosom." After the death of David's mother, The Murdstones fire Peggotty, and she returns to her brother Daniel's house, with David in tow. On the way, the cart driver Barkis once more proposes, and David tells Peggotty he thinks it would be a good thing if she married him. At Daniel Peggotty's house, David sees that his childhood friend, little Emily, is now a pretty young lady. He tells her about his friend Steerforth, and she is filled with admiration of the young man she's never met. Peggotty marries Barkis and goes off to live at his house. David feels abandoned once again. The Murdstones announce they're taking David out of school, hiring him out to a shoe-dyeing factory. Only 10 years old, half-starved and humiliated, he labors all day beside street urchins in a warehouse filled with rats, dirt, and smoke. But he has a friend in Mr. Micawber, the man whose family he's boarding with. Mr. Micawber is a chatty, happy-go-lucky fellow who happens to be in trouble with several creditors. The Micawbers are eventually put in a debtors' prison where David visits them often. When the Micawbers are released from prison, they decide to move to the country to stay with relatives. David, friendless once again, runs away from the warehouse and heads for his great-aunt Betsy's house. On the way, a thief steals his meager belongings and few coins. He arrives at Aunt Betsy's after a 23-mile journey on foot, ragged and exhausted. Aunt Betsy is touched by his pathetic appearance and has obviously recovered from her disappointment that he's not a girl. She takes him in. Living with Aunt Betsy is a somewhat dotty old gentleman named Mr. Dick, whom she has rescued from an insane asylum. When Aunt Betsy asks Mr. Dick what they should do about David, the eccentric gentleman replies, "Wash him." The Murdstones arrive at Aunt Betsy's to discuss David's fate, but Aunt Betsy sends them angrily away, saying from now on the boy is her responsibility. She then tells David that from here on he'll be known as Trotwood Copperfield. David tells us, "And thus I began my new life in a new name and with everything new about me." David's new name is abbreviated to Trot, and he makes a new friend in the wacky Mr. Dick, who loves nothing more than to fly kites with David. But one day Aunt Betsy says she's sending David to a decent school in Canterbury, run by a Mr. Strong. On the way to the new school, they stop at the home of his aunt's lawyer, Mr. Wickfield, where David is to become a boarder. A red-haired 15-year-old boy answers the door and stares suspiciously at David. It's Uriah Heep, Wickfield's clerk. When Aunt Betsy leaves, she gives David the advice, "Never be mean in anything, never be false, never be cruel." David becomes fond of Wickfield's sweet daughter Agnes. He feels he still loves little Emily, but of Agnes he says, "I feel there are goodness, peace, and truth wherever Agnes is." David likes his new school. The students are respected and given lots of liberty. David gets to know Uriah Heep, the clerk, and dislikes him. He's always prying for information. Then he discovers that Mr. Micawber, the man whose house he stayed at when he worked in the warehouse, is now friendly with Uriah Heep. It makes him uneasy. At 17, David completes school and must think of a profession. He meets his friend from his first school, James Steerforth, who is now a college man. David decides, instead of entering college, to enter law, and signs on as an apprentice to a law firm. On a visit to see his dear friends Ham and Emily, David takes Steerforth with him. Steerforth thinks it will be amusing to see these people of the lower classes together. Emily, now a pretty young lady, is engaged to Ham, but she seems attracted to Steerforth and is impressed by his social status and charm. David goes to visit Agnes, the daughter of Wickfield. Agnes warns David about Steerforth, whom she doesn't like. She also tells him that her father's clerk, Uriah Heep, is getting too much influence over her father, who is drinking heavily. Heep is about to become his partner. David is appalled, but Agnes begs him to be polite to Heep to prevent trouble. Later, Uriah tells David he intends to marry Agnes. Meanwhile, David goes with his employer, Mr. Spenlow, to visit Spenlow's daughter Dora, who has just returned from Paris. When they arrive, David falls instantly in love with Dora. But he's shocked when he sees that her paid companion is Jane Murdstone, the sister of his cruel stepfather. They both agree not to reveal their pasts. One day David goes to visit his friend Traddles, the devoted pal from his first school. Traddles lives in a poor section of town and is working at a menial job, trying to save money so he can marry the daughter of a curate. Traddles' landlord turns out to be none other than Mr. Micawber, David's cheery old landlord. David warns Traddles not to sign any bills for Micawber, but it's too late. Traddles has already signed. Steerforth visits David and tells him he's been vacationing at the Peggoty's house. He bears a letter from Peggotty herself, telling David her husband, Barkis, is dying. David himself is now leaving for the Peggotys, but before he goes, Steerforth puts his hands on David's shoulders and says, "Think of me at my best if circumstances should ever part us." David is bewildered. David arrives at the Peggotys just in time to see Barkis die. He has left Peggotty sizable savings. Meanwhile, Daniel and Ham Peggotty are anxiously awaiting little Emily's return home. She's late. Soon a note from Emily turns up. She's run off with a man, but doesn't name him. It's a servant who identifies him as Steerforth. David feels responsible because he introduced them and cries. Emily's uncle Daniel vows to search the world for Emily, and Ham, her abandoned suitor, wears a grim and murderous look. David returns to the city and becomes engaged to Dora, the daughter of his employer, Mr. Spenlow. Then Aunt Betsy shows up at his door to tell him she's lost all her money and they are now penniless. Peggotty offers her own savings to Betsy, but the better solution is for David to find a wage-paying job. David takes a part-time job with Mr. Strong, the kind schoolmaster of the school Aunt Betsy sent him to. Dr. Strong is now retired in London. In his free time, David learns shorthand so he can be a reporter. Tommy Traddles, his former schoolmate, encourages him and helps him succeed. David discovers that Mr. Micawber is now working for Uriah Heep, who is in complete control of the Wickfield firm. When he turns 21, David marries Dora Spenlow, whose father has now died, leaving her only debts and no inheritance. One day he runs into Daniel Peggotty. He tells David of his extensive search across Europe, looking for little Emily and Steerforth. He is returning to Europe tomorrow to begin the search again. David also receives a letter from Mr. Micawber's wife, saying her husband has become secretive and morose since working for Uriah Heep. David now begins moonlighting as a fiction writer and gains some fame. But his home life is unhappy. Dora turns out to be a terribly inept housewife, and their house is always in a state of chaos. Furthermore, she's unable to offer David any moral support or understanding. About this time, David hears, through Steerforth's servant, that his former friend has deserted Emily in Italy, advising her to marry a respectable person. Emily went almost mad and had to be confined, but she's escaped and disappeared. David tells Emily's uncle, Daniel Peggotty, the news. They decide she would probably try to hide in London, and they enlist the aid of a friend there to help them find her. David is writing successful books now, and Dora is pregnant. But the baby is stillborn, and Dora remains frail and weak. Months later, Daniel Peggotty tracks Emily down in London and takes her back home, where they begin preparations to move to Australia to start a new life. Meanwhile, Mr. Micawber, now working for Uriah Heep, has invited David, his school friend Traddles, Aunt Betsy, and Mr. Dick to join him at Wickfield's, where he will make certain disclosures about Heep. In the presence of Heep, Micawber details Heep's fraud, the misappropriation of funds, forgeries, and embezzlement, including of Aunt Betsy's money. Aunt Betsy had never said anything because she had thought Mr. Wickfield had embezzled it. David goes off to get the police. Micawber decides to join the Peggotys on their trip to Australia, where he too can start a new life. A short time later, Dora dies, after asking for Agnes and telling her she would be happy if she married David. Dora also apologizes to David before she dies for her failure as a wife. David is remorseful and grief-stricken. This tragedy is followed by another. His old school friend Steerforth, who seduced little Emily, is drowned in a gale, and the noble Ham dies trying to save him. Ham inadvertently and unawares has sacrificed his life for the man he hates most, the man who seduced his fiancée. David arranges to keep the event secret from Daniel and Emily Peggotty so they can leave for Australia in peace. David travels in Europe for 3 years, trying to forget the tragedies of his life. Only letters from Agnes bring him out of his despondency. He begins to write again, sending his manuscripts to ๊tʃɑrlz, who gets them published. After 3 years, his reputation as a writer is established. His health is returned, and he feels the pull of home. David has also come to realize that he loves Agnes, but he fears it's too late to approach her, and that he, in his words, has deservedly lost her. He returns to England, where he first visits old friends. He looks up his school chum ๊tʃɑrlz and finds him happily married to the curator's daughter he always loved. He visits Aunt Betsy, Peggotty, and Mr. Dick, all living comfortably together in Dover. His aunt catches David up on the news. Mr. Micawber has sent money from Australia to repay her for Heap's embezzlement. She also mentions that Agnes is as good and beautiful as ever, and seems to have formed an attachment. But Aunt Betsy won't name names. She says it's only a suspicion on her part. David visits Agnes and tries to extract details of this attachment, but Agnes is reticent. Out of respect for her feelings, he gives up and departs. David moves in with his aunt and continues his writing. He also spends much time answering the large amounts of mail he now receives. One letter is from the cruel old headmaster, Mr. Creakle, who invites David to come inspect the model prison he now runs. David and ๊tʃɑrlz go off to see it. In one of the cells, they run across Uriah Heep. David visits Agnes once a week and reads his developing novel to her. Her comments are insightful, and he wishes he had married her instead of Dora. One day his aunt tells him that she thinks Agnes is about to be married. This goads him into dashing over to Agnes's and confessing his love. Agnes falls into his arms, saying it is he she has always loved. They are married, and David Copperfield seems happy at last. David now writes that his memoirs are almost completed, but for one thread in the web that he must now unravel. 10 years have passed, and he is happily married to Agnes, has numerous children, and ever-widening fame. One night a visitor appears, and it turns out to be Daniel Peggotty, back from Australia. There they've prospered as farmers. Emily could have married several times, but never did. Mr. Micawber has paid off all his debts and is prospering as a district magistrate. Before returning to Australia, Mr. Peggotty takes a little earth and a tuft of grass from his nephew Ham's grave. He says it's for Emily. At the end of the book, David relates what became of his many friends. Aunt Betsy, now 80, is strong as ever. Peggotty, too, is still energetic and now takes care of his children like she once took care of him. Mr. Dick is with them, too, teaching David's children to fly kites. ๊tʃɑrlz is on the way to a judgeship. As David closes his memoirs, he says he thinks of one face shining on him like a heavenly light, that of Agnes, who will always guide his life upward. In the long saga that is David Copperfield's life, readers can see many parallels to the life of Charles Dickens. He, too, was a child laborer. He, too, apprenticed in a law firm. He also became a reporter, and later a writer of fiction, as David did. He had the success and fame of David, and he felt himself trapped in a luckless marriage as David did. It's been said that the character of Agnes, which is almost too perfect to be credible, is Dickens' own fantasy of what an ideal wife would have been. But beyond any personal catharsis the book may have been for Dickens, it's also a book rich in social commentary and morality. For instance, in contrasting the two schools that David attended, the author offers his own ideas on education. The first school, run by the sadistic Mr. Creakle, is clearly the worst form of education, although such schools and such schoolmasters were not uncommon in England. Creakle's school was based on the principle of cruel discipline. It was run by people with no experience as educators. Creakle himself was a former hop stealer, who relished the opportunity to exercise their sadistic love for flogging children. The teachers were exploited and underpaid, the students badly housed and poorly fed, and the lessons were more like torture than learning experiences. Learning was accomplished only because the students feared punishment if they made mistakes. At the second school David attended, run by the kindly Mr. Strong, we have Dickens' ideal of what a school should be. Teachers appealed to the honor and good faith of their students, who were even given a role in the management of the school. Thus the students rose to the expectation and demonstrated responsibility. They also had lots of freedom, many opportunities for games and play, and learned happily and willingly rather than by coercion. It was Dickens' theory, perhaps not revolutionary today, but certainly debatable in the 1850s, that love was more conducive to growth and learning than fear. In his private life, too, Dickens fought for reform of the educational system. In another novel, Nicholas Nickleby, he vented his full fury on English schools and their soul-destroying cruelty. His attacks led to a parliamentary investigation and to the eventual closing of many of the worst schools. Charles Dickens is still known as one of the first crusaders for children's rights, urging gentleness and understanding in place of the rigid discipline and control of emotions so popular in Victorian England. As his life progressed, Dickens' concern for abused and exploited children became a passion. This novel, as in most of his works, contains numerous references to and scenes of the neglect of children, particularly emotional neglect, which he considered far more serious than physical neglect. He deplored the blatant cruelty represented by such characters as David's stepfather and the headmaster Creakle, but he also seemed appalled by the mere passivity of those who watched and failed to interfere, such as David's mother had done. David Copperfield also contains thinly disguised comments on the treatment of the insane and on Britain's prison system. Aunt Betsy and her kind treatment of the harmless lunatic Mr. Dick suggest a solution to the brutal and inhumane insane asylums. Dickens felt such people benefited far more from compassionate treatment in a home-like environment, another theory that's been proven correct. When David, along with his friend Traddles, goes to visit Mr. Creakle's ideal prison towards the end of the book, it's another opportunity for Dickens to hold forth on a favorite subject, the structure of prisons and treatment of prisoners. But in this case, the author wasn't the liberal he was on other issues. Although he strongly opposed imprisonment of debtors, Dickens was also an outspoken opponent of prisons which coddled their prisoners and made life comfortable and easy for them. In many cases, such prisoners found better food and lodging in prison than they'd ever had on the streets, as if prison were almost a reward for their crimes. It's not a surprising view when we consider the Dickens sense of morality, which is also clearly reflected in David Copperfield. To begin with, Dickens shared the Protestant ethic that most of his readers held, and which had motivated the lower and middle class of England for many years. That ethic was based on industriousness, hard work, and sobriety. It held that financial and social success were earned through tireless effort and prudent behavior. David Copperfield's success at the end of the novel was earned just that way, by perseverance and patient and continuous energy. In his memoirs, Copperfield states, "Whatever I have tried to do in life, I have devoted myself to do well. That whatever I have devoted myself to, I have devoted myself to completely. That in great aims and in small, I have always been thoroughly in earnest." This is the philosophy and the message of the novel, but it's also made a little less grim by another Dickens philosophy, his optimistic belief that there will be help along the way. That belief is expressed literally by the cheerful Mr. Micawber, who's fond of saying, "Something is bound to turn up." And for David Copperfield, things do turn up. His Aunt Betsy turns up to rescue him from abandonment. His friend Traddles turns up to help him with his writing. His friend Micawber turns up and offers to reveal the crimes of Uriah Heep. And Agnes keeps her love on reserve for many years so she can be his final, most treasured reward when he finally reaches maturity. At the end of the book, all who have been wronged are righted, and everyone is cured of their grief and compensated for their losses. It's almost a fairy tale ending, but it's Dickens' way of proclaiming his belief that goodwill, perseverance, humor, and honest work will all be ultimately rewarded. In our next session, we'll explore another Dickens classic, this time in a very different setting, and with an ending that is far more bittersweet than fairy tale.
This is the end of the session.